website.
Yep, thanks for the reminder. Okay. I will start recording here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Neil. We are excited to be here. I think many of you probably joined us last month for a presentation on the allowable use of special education funds. We are doing these presentations under contract with USBE as part of a contract to provide additional coaching to LEAs in Utah to help you all understand fiscal requirements and become compliant. And we are available. Neil will send you our contact information for coaching for LEAs as well. So if you have additional questions about today's presentation or other questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to help you. Our topic today is Coordinated Early Intervening Services, or CEIS. And this training is designed to help either new or experienced program and business administrators build their capacity about what CEIS are. We're going to have a discussion about the difference between voluntary and mandatory CEIS. We're going to talk about calculation methodology and how to make decisions about allowable use of funds, and then talk a little bit about the reporting requirements related to CEIS. And our presenters today, as Neil said, are Anthony Makuna. Anthony is a WestEd Senior Program Associate in the Special Education Policy and Practice Division, and lives in Boise, Idaho. Previously was employed at the Idaho Department of Education in Boise. Allison Davey is a program associate also in our Special Education Policy and Practice area at WestEd, and she is a former employee at the Tennessee Department of Education. You'll be hearing from her in a minute. And I am Sarah Dutray. I have been at WestEd for just over 2 years working in special education policy and practice and school finance. I started my career as a special education teacher in Utah. I live in Logan, so my kids are at Logan City School District, and I have a child that's in special education. And so very invested in making sure we have a strong system here in Utah. And it's been great to work with Neil Stevens and Cole Shakespeare under the direction of Leah Voorhees as they are strengthening the fiscal monitoring, but also the fiscal technical assistance related to special education. The objectives of our session today are, like I said, to increase your capacity to meet the fiscal requirements related to voluntary or mandatory coordinated early intervening services, increase your knowledge of state-specific requirements, how they're different from the federal requirements, how Utah has defined specific pieces, identify allowable and non-allowable expenditures, think through how we can and cannot spend CEIS funds, and then point you to some resources that will really help you with thinking through decision-making around whether you want to use CEIS funds, how to use them, and how to track the required data elements for those. So our agenda, will follow along with that pretty quickly. We're going to do an overview. I'll turn it to Allison for the overview. Compare voluntary and mandatory CEIS, talk about the state requirements. We want to make sure we talk today about the interaction of early intervening services, CEIS, and maintenance of effort. And this is especially important due to the increase in IDEA funds coming through the American Recovery Plan. So we want to touch on that, talk about how we calculate CEIS amounts, allowable uses of funds, and then we're going to demonstrate an Excel tool that was developed by some national technical assistance centers that we all work on as well in helping states for tracking CEIS funds and students who receive CEIS. And then we will end today with a question and answer section. And to get us started, we are going to have a poll. And we just want to assess your baseline understanding. So if you rated your knowledge of both voluntary coordinated early intervening services, or CEIS, and mandatory comprehensive CEIS, the fiscal requirements for those under IDEA, would you rate yourself as very strong, strong, fair, or weak? Anthony, will there be a poll, a Zoom poll that will come? There it is. Okay, great. So go ahead and rate your knowledge. Great. It looks like we have a really good mix of people. I see a lot of district people, charter, familiar names. Thank you for joining. Thanks for signing in the chat so we know who's here.
So
Okay, Anthony, should we?
80% have voted, so we can end the poll.
Great.
Share results.
Oh, this is good news. It looks like we have an opportunity today. So it looks like we have about half and half at fair and weak about understanding of the fiscal requirements related to CEIS. So that's great news for us because we are excited to teach you about this and we won't be worried that we're repeating things you already know. And for those of you that rated yourselves as strong, please, if we say anything that's inconsistent with what you've heard, ask questions because we're happy to talk through that. But with that, I am going to turn it to Allison, right, for an overview?
Yep.
Great, thanks, Allison.
All right, hi everybody. As Sarah said, my name is Allison Davey. I am really pleased to be here with you today. Before we jump into the fiscal requirements of coordinated early intervening services, let's take a look at what these services actually are, how they benefit students, and really how they also benefit school districts, and why they're included in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Having this context is going to lay the foundation for this work, but it's also going to help you increase your own capacity, your own ability to implement these requirements. So what are coordinated early intervening services? Simply put, these are services to help children who need additional academic or behavioral support to be successful in school. The services can include professional development or educational and behavioral evaluations, services, and supports. Under IDEA, the provision of CEIS can be voluntary or it can be mandatory. Voluntary CEIS allows local education agencies to use up to 15% of their IDEA Part B, Section 611 and 619 funds to implement those activities. Note the key words here, allows and up to 15%. You're going to hear us repeat that several times throughout today's session. But voluntary CEIS, keep in mind the word allows and up to 15%. IDEA regulations guiding the mandatory provision of CEIS, which is referred to as comprehensive CEIS, or as you're going to hear us say, and you're going to see throughout the presentation today, CEIS, were revised in 2016. And these regulations require LEAs that have been identified by their states as having significant disproportionality based on race or ethnicity, to reserve exactly 15% of its IDEA Part B, 611 and 619 funds to implement CCEIS. And again, the key words here for mandatory comprehensive CEIS are required and must use exactly 15% of funds. All right, so why are early intervening services important? Well, we know what research says. Research has shown us that the sooner that we intervene, the better our outcomes are going to be. So the earlier that we can address a student's learning problems or difficulties, the greater the chance that we're going to ameliorate or decrease those difficulties in severity, and the better our student outcomes are going to be. Through the implementation of coordinated early intervening services, whether it is voluntary or mandatory, we can identify and address learning and behavior difficulties early. We can reduce delays in providing support, and delays in addressing a student's learning difficulties often result in a need for increased support later at a greater cost to districts. So what that means is that by providing coordinated early intervening services, early, it not only supports student need, but it could have a positive impact for districts in the future as well. And then finally, we can better ensure that at-risk students are referred for special education and related services only when necessary. So what this can help, for example, is it could prevent or reduce inappropriate over-identification of particular subgroups of children with disabilities. Oh, hang on just one second. Okay. All right, so who can benefit from these services? Whether the LEA is participating in voluntary CEIS or mandatory CCEIS impacts the students that the LEA may serve with those funds that it's reserved for this purpose. Voluntary CEIS may be provided to children without a disability and in kindergarten through 12th grade, with a particular emphasis on students in kindergarten through 3rd grade. Whereas if your district is implementing mandatory CCEIS, those services may be provided to children with or without a disability. And also you can provide those services earlier. You can start at age 3 and provide those services through grade 12. Also important to note here though, is that although children with disabilities can benefit from these services, you cannot limit mandatory CCEIS services to children with disabilities. All right, so we have a poll question here.
So the question is, how many types of coordinated intervening services are defined under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA? So this is a test for us to see if you are paying attention to what Alison was saying. Right? We'll give it a few seconds. Okay. We have 64% of participants who have voted, and it's not moving anymore. So I will end the poll and share the results.
All right, so here are our results. We've got 78% who said 2, and we've got about 22% who said 3. If you said 2, you are correct. There are really 2 types of coordinated early intervening services defined under IDEA. Voluntary coordinated early intervening services and mandatory coordinated early intervening services.
Right.
All right, let me get my notes here. All right, so now that we kind of have a basic understanding of what those 2 types are and how they benefit children, let's take a closer look at those differences that we've kind of started discussing, the differences between those. So each type of CEIS has its own distinct set of requirements that must be followed. Should your district implement CEIS, the first thing you've got to know is this voluntary, or has our district been identified with significant disproportionality and we are implementing mandatory CCEIS? You have to know this to ensure that you're following the appropriate set of requirements. So the 2004 reauthorization of IDEA allows local education agencies to use up to 15% of their Part B funds for CEIS. And then in cases of significant disproportionality, requires LEAs to reserve the maximum 15% for coordinated early intervening services. In December of 2016, the Office of Special Education Programs finalized new regulations on significant disproportionality, and these regulations clarified the definition of significant disproportionality, which is what triggers the mandatory use of Part B funds for CCEIS. The new regulations also created some differences in how these funds may be used between voluntary and mandatory. It's critical that you know and understand these key differences to ensure that your district is using funds reserved for these purposes appropriately. So we've kind of started discussing these a little already, But this slide is a really nice side-by-side comparison. So let's just talk through them quickly, even though we've hit on a few. So as you can see on the left-hand side here, we've got voluntary, and on the right, we have mandatory. You can see the citation for the regulations there. So I encourage you to look that up and to bookmark it and save it for easy access later. Voluntary CEIS, what triggers that? Well, that's a decision at the local level. The district makes that decision, and it's based on student need for academic and behavioral support. For mandatory CEIS, as we've said, that is triggered when the state has determined that the district has significant disproportionality. Voluntary funds, a district may reserve up to 15% of its Part B awards, or it may reserve less. It may not reserve more than 15%. But if you have been identified with significant disproportionality and you have to implement mandatory CCEIS, you've got to reserve exactly 15% of your Section 611 and 619 funds. And then remember, as we discussed earlier, voluntary CEIS, you can serve students in kindergarten through 12th grade. And mandatory CCEIS, you can start earlier. You can serve students at age 3 through 12th grade. And then finally, another key difference in who you're serving in your population is voluntary CEIS, you are only serving students without disabilities. They are not identified as students with disabilities. Mandatory CCEIS, you can serve students with disabilities and you can serve students without disabilities. Just remember that you can't limit those services exclusively to children with disabilities. And I hope I'm not talking too fast. Okay, so let's talk at a high level about permitted activities for voluntary and mandatory. In addition to the key differences that we just discussed, it's also important to be aware of differences in requirements for how funds may be used between these two types of CEIS. We'll get into some more nuanced questions about specific uses of funds later in the presentation, but at a high level, for LEAs that have chosen to voluntarily reserve up to 15% of Part B allocations to implement CEIS, the LEA may use funds to provide professional development for teachers and other school staff. I want to unpack that just a little bit. The professional development can't be any professional development. Its purpose must be to enable teachers and school staff to deliver scientifically based academic and behavioral interventions. So this might include, for example, scientifically based literacy instruction, or if appropriate, instruction on the use of adaptive and instructional software. In addition to professional development, districts may also use voluntary CEIS funds to provide educational and behavioral evaluation services and supports, including scientifically based literacy instruction. All right, for LEAs that have been identified by the SEA as having significant disproportionality, that's a mouthful, the reserve funds must be used to provide professional development and educational and behavioral evaluations, services, and supports. These activities that the LEA implements must address the factors and the policy, practice, or procedures that have contributed to significant disproportionality within the LEA. So what this means is that once an LEA has been identified as having significant disproportionality, it has to review its own policies, practices, and procedures and determine what are those underlying factors that have contributed to the significant disproportionality. Some of the more common examples of factors that have been found to contribute to disproportionality include a lack of access to scientifically based instruction, economic, cultural, or linguistic barriers to appropriate identification or placement, inappropriate use of disciplinary removals, and a lack of access to appropriate diagnostic screening. All right, and with everything in education, there are reporting requirements for CEIS. States are required to report to the U.S. Department of Education the amount of Part B funds that each LEA sets aside for CEIS, whether voluntary or mandatory. And they must also report the number of children who receive those services. States have to report each LEA that was required to reserve and use funds for CEIS, and the reason that the LEA was identified with significant disproportionality as well. Because states are required to report this information to USED, that means that you, the local education agency, are in turn responsible for tracking and reporting the information to the state agency. For voluntary CEIS, LEAs must track and report the number of children who received early intervening services, and the number of children who received early intervening services and subsequently received special education and related services during the preceding 2-year period. For mandatory CCEIS, an LEA is required to publicly report on the revision of policies, practices, and procedures, and OSEP has said that it may add additional reporting requirements at a later date for mandatory CCEIS. So as you can see, there are several key differences between the two types of CEIS. So it's important to be aware of what these differences are, or that they exist, and to be able to communicate those to your colleagues when necessary. To keep these distinctions straight, the IDEA Data Center has created an excellent resource that compares the key elements that we've just discussed. It compares grades and ages served, groups served, the amount of funds reserved under either mandatory or voluntary, what those permitted activities are, and what the reporting requirements are. And the chart also includes citations for the IDEA regulations. So there is a link to that on this slide, and I think we can also post a link in chat. I encourage you to bookmark this link. That way you can remember that you don't have to remember the requirements, you can remember where you can find information about these requirements. And let me see, Anthony, are you able to post that in chat?
No, because I'm sharing the screen, but if you can.
Hold on, I think I can do it. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to do it right now. Let's see. Everyone. All right, hopefully that went through, but just click that link, bookmark it, and you will always have it for easy reference.
All right. Right. Now it's time for a poll question. So an LEA is implementing voluntary CEIS plan to use the reserve funds to provide professional development service development to its preschool teachers. Is this an appropriate use of reserve CEIS funds, voluntary CEIS funds? What do you guys think?
Well, we're getting some mixed responses on this one.
Yeah. We'll give it a few seconds.
Feel free to answer out loud too, or venture. If you were last week, some of these answers are not yes, no. Some are, but feel free to venture a guess out loud as well if you'd like to.
Yep. And if you can drop in the chat, why do you think it's a yes? Why do you think it's a no? And why do you think it's a maybe? We want to hear your way of thinking.
Yeah, this is pretty evenly split.
So,
all right, I don't think we're getting any new ones, Anthony.
Yep, we have 75% of people who voted. I will share the results.
All right, so the majority of you said, and we've got a pretty even split though between all three. Well, I will tell you what I was thinking when I wrote this question, and then we can talk through if you have different thoughts on that. When I wrote this question, I said the answer was no. And the reason is that this question is really focused on who benefits. So there's some key words here. One is voluntary CEIS. And if you remember, voluntary CEIS is to be used in kindergarten through 12th grade. It's mandatory CEIS that you can start using with students at age 3. So when I wrote this question, what I was thinking was, if we're providing professional development to preschool teachers, who is it that is benefiting from that professional development. Preschool students. And so since this is voluntary CEIS, my thinking is that no, this would not be an appropriate use of funds. Now, I'm curious if anybody wants to unmute or share in chat what you might be thinking if you said maybe or if you said yes.
So we have a couple comments in the chat from Diane and Craig. They said because voluntary is only for kindergarten through 12, grade 12, it's not for preschool.
That's the correct answer. So that's correct. Voluntary is only for kindergarten through grade 12. So that's why I said no, this would not be an appropriate use of funds. Any other thoughts?
Awesome. And feel free to unmute and speak if you want.
I think Karen said because the slide said so.
Sarah,
I'm disappointed in you. You usually provide us some sort of reasoning why it should be maybe, or that we definitely use it.
Okay, Neil, if you asked for it. So I do want to say that if you were not only providing it to preschool teachers, you may be able to get your preschool teachers, they might be able to participate. And I'll say why I think this is the case is that CEIS cannot be provided to preschool students. However, just like for all other IDEA funds, and I'm going to bring up a topic that I brought up last time a couple times too, but incidental benefit applies. So if maybe in this case, my voluntary CEIS plan is services for students in kindergarten through grade 3 or kindergarten through grade 2. But I think, gosh, if my preschool teachers participated, it would really help them as well, even though those kids that they're serving aren't going to be receiving coordinated early intervening services. And as long as the cost doesn't increase or the quality doesn't decrease of that professional development, the preschool teachers probably could participate. It's funny, Neil, I know Neil joked that when he said that, but I generally am thinking, as I obviously was, like what could possibly be the exception. But in this case, it's only to preschool teachers. It doesn't seem like that is incidental benefit for the preschool teachers. It's targeted toward them to help the kids they're serving. So yeah, pretty solidly a no, unless you added those caveats.
So I want to add a twist.
Okay.
What the training professional development centers around child find activities and how to identify students with potential disabilities?
So I think the problem with that is that child find isn't an allowable cost under early intervening services because early intervening services are not, that's separate from child find. You have to have child find under IDEA. That's an allowable cost with IDEA funds, but would not be appropriate early intervening services. Those should be for students who are not eligible for special ed but need extra support. So eventually it could feed into child find, but I think as soon as you say child find, that's something that's required under IDEA, so it's not going to be allowable for CEIS.
I wanted to pose that difference because I get that question a lot when Elias ask, how can I spend this money? And the question is, well, how does child find relate to CEIS?
Mm-hmm. And it may be like a few steps removed, right? So, and Anthony, don't let me go too far off here because I know we're going to get to some of these later, but if you're thinking about your multi-tiered system of support and its role in child find, there are some pieces of that in different tiers and different pieces of that it may be appropriate to use CEIS funds for part of it. That system also could be connected to child find. But as soon as we're in that process of specifically screening kids to see if they need to be evaluated or evaluating students to determine whether they have a disability, that is a pretty fine line that shouldn't be funded with CEIS. But luckily for you all, it's an allowable cost under IDEA, so you can use the funds for it, just don't make them CEIS funds to use them.
Yep, good job, Neil, for calling Sarah, because Sarah is really creative.
Which can benefit, it benefits too, but yeah,
yep.
we can have a try to trick Sarah. I feel like that's Neil's goal, so I'll be prepared.
That sounds like a good PD activity. Try to trick Sarah. I like that.
I think we're ready for the next poll question, unless we have any more comments. The chat is quiet. So let's launch the next one. An LEA may use funds for mandatory CCEIS for behavior intervention for children with or without disabilities in middle school, and particularly or not exclusively for children in group who are significantly over-identified. What do you guys think? Can the LEA use funds for that purpose? And again, feel free to drop in the chat, why do you think this is true or false? And why do you feel like you're not sure? This one was a tricky one, Alison.
All right, we've got about 48% of people who have voted so far, 50%.
50%? It's still going a little bit. Let's give it a few seconds. I think we're stuck at 53%. I will hand the poll and share the results.
Okay, so looks like the majority of people said true, and that is the correct response. This is a school district who has been identified with significant disproportionality, so they're implementing mandatory CCEIS. And so we know that mandatory CCEIS can benefit children with and without disabilities in middle school, and really starting at age 3 up through 12th grade. But it's particularly for children in groups who were significantly over-identified. So the correct answer is true on this one.
Yep. And we have a comment from Elizabeth who says the funds are designated to cover the over-identified groups, but using the funding may help reduce over-identification of all subgroups. And that's right on spot. Okay.
Yeah, good comment.
Anybody else? Okay, so if you don't have any other comments, then we can move on to the next section. Okay, I'll take it over from here. So now let's talk about your state-specific requirements for CEIS and CCEIS. First of all, what is Utah's definition of CCEIS? It's pretty much the same definition that is being used under IDEA. Voluntary CEIS is funds that can be set aside for children without disabilities, but that are in need of maybe specific assistance. And the funds can be set aside up to 15% of your total combined allocation, IDE allocation, and it's meant to serve children from kindergarten through 12, just like Alison mentioned. And mandatory is no longer voluntary. It's no longer optional. You have significant disproportionality. The state has identified that you have over-identification, and then you have to set aside 15% of your total allocation, and the funds can be used for students with or without disabilities. Same definition as IDEA. So if your LEA wants to set aside CEIS funds, voluntary CEIS fund, then you have to indicate that within your application that you intend to set aside 15% of your funds for CEIS purposes. And there is an internal review process at the USBE where your plan will be reviewed by the program team and the fiscal team. And then if they determine that your plan is adequate, it will be approved, and you will be able to set aside 15% of your funds for CEIS. And for mandatory CEIS, so if the state determines that you have significant disproportionality, your LEA has significant disproportionality based on race or ethnicity, and that will in respect to maybe a specific disability category, like placement in a particular educational settings, or significant disproportionality because of the incidence duration and the type of disciplinary action, including suspensions or expulsions. So if, it is determined that your LEA has significant disproportionality, based on this criteria, you will be required to set aside 15% of your combined IDEA allocation. And same thing for CCEIS, for mandatory CEIS. You have to submit your plan. The plan will be reviewed by the USB team, program team, and fiscal team. If they feel like your plan is not addressing the issues, is not addressing significant disproportionality, they will probably send it back to you. And if the plan is adequate and is approved, then you will be able to budget 15% of your grant, IDEA grants for CEIS activities. And when you budget funds for the two provisions, you also have to track your activities. So LEAs are required to use this LEA CEIS tracker to track and report student information related to expenditures and also related to expenditure and students. And the information that are required are the number of students that have been served under CEIS in the first year. And then you want to report the number of students who were served in that first year that subsequently received special education in year 2. And then also, if you served students for CEIS in year 1, we want to find out if you also identify the student for special education services in year 3. So it's pretty much a 3-year tracking time frame for CEIS activity when we talk about tracking the students. And also you have to track your expenditures. And your expenditure would probably, should show how you're spending money towards your activities and then how does it compare to your initial budgets. And the allocation process for voluntary and mandatory CEIS. Just like your overall IDEA allocation, there is a portion of the CEIS funds that is made available to your LEA when your application is approved. And Neil, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 50%, right? You're muted.
Yes, allocations were initially given at 50% originally. I'm hoping by the end of this month, I'll have the full allocations made available to all LEAs.
Yeah, and the same way CEIS is also made available at 50%.
Yes.
Thank you. And the remaining 50% will be made available to your LEA when the final allocations amounts are determined. And with that being said, when the funds are available to you and you start spending those funds, the USB has the responsibility of monitoring and tracking your expenses. And how will they track your CEIS expenditures? It will be through a supplemental CEIS expenditure report. So when you will submit your reimbursement request, if your LEA set aside CEIS, voluntary CEIS, or if your LEA was required to have mandatory CEIS, when you submit your reimbursement request, then you'll have to submit a report that would include the year-to-date expenditures for CEIS purposes and how do they compare with your budget. Okay, any questions about it or any comments? And if we are going too fast, just let us know. And then if you have questions, always feel free to drop them in the chats. I don't see anything in the chats. Let's move on to the calculation of CEIS amount. So, voluntary CEIS. This is a situation, a Sunny Day School District wishes to voluntarily reserve funds for CEIS, and the district will not reduce MOE. The district received 1.4 million of IDEA Section 611 and 1 million of IDEA Section 619 funds. How will the amount of CEIS be determined? You add the two allocations together, 611 and 619. The total is 2.4 million, and multiply that amount with 15% rate. And the amount available for voluntary CEIS is 360,000. And that means this is voluntary. You could choose to set aside up to 350,000. So you could set aside less, or you could set aside nothing, or you could set aside a maximum of 360,000 for voluntary CEIS. Next situation, that's when it's no longer optional. It's a must. You don't have a choice. The school district has been identified by the State Department of Education as having significant disproportionality. The district received 1 million of IDEA Section 611 allocation and 400,000 for Section 619. The total amount of both allocation is 1.4 million. Multiplied by 15%, then the amount that the LEA must use for CCEIS is 210,000. And this is a must, it's not optional. It's not up to 250,000. No, it is exactly 210,000 that you need to set aside and use for CEIS, mandatory CEIS. With that being said, we're ready for our next poll question.
Yes, so may an LEA reserve more than 15% of its IDEA Part B allocations, Section 611 and 619, for CEIS? Yes, no, or are you unsure? And
Okay.
Anthony, it looks like you shared the poll, right?
Yeah, I did.
All right.
And this is a test to see if you were paying attention to what I was saying. And also, please let us know, why do you think it's a yes? Why do you think it's a no? You can drop that in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak. It doesn't look like we're moving, and we can hand the poll and share the results. Okay, we have 82% of you that are saying that an LEA may reserve more than 15%. And then we have 15% of you that are saying that yes, they can reserve more than 15%, and 3% that are unsure. So the majority of people think that they cannot reserve more than 15% for CEIS, and that is the correct answer. So 15% is the cap. That's the maximum amount allowed. And then I will see a comment in the chat from Claire, using IDEA fund for students not identified with disability. Okay. So yeah, the correct answer is no. 15% is your cap for CEIS purposes. Let's move on to the next question. We have another.
Oh, sorry, Anthony.
Yeah, go ahead.
An LEA that participates in voluntary CEIS must set aside exactly 15% of its total IDEA Section 611 and 619 awards. Is that true? Is it false? Or are you unsure?
Again, just to see if you were paying attention. So we have a question in the chat. What is the difference? IDEA Section 611 and 619, our district only gets one allocation. Well, good question. Section 619 is the IDEA allocation that is available for children with disabilities ages 3 through 21. And 619 is only restricted to those students ages 3 through 5. And the 611 is usually a bigger allocation than the 619 allocation. I hope that answers your question. Oh, Sarah already provided an answer. All right. Did you share the results?
I did.
All right. And then the correct answer is false. An LEA that participates in voluntary must set aside exactly 15%. No. Under voluntary CEIS, it's optional and they can set aside up to 15%, but it doesn't have to be exactly 15%. And 91% of the participants got it right, so good job. Sarah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'll just add to this one nuance that we get asked about often is if you have to take 15% of both of those grant awards. And that question is often asked because the Section 619, or sometimes we call that the preschool grant, is so much smaller. And the requirements are that the amount you may or must, in the case of mandatory, set aside, that amount comes from the combined total. But when you actually use the funds, you can choose to use them all from your Section 611, or you could use them all from Section 619. Probably wouldn't do that. You may not even have enough money to do that, but you don't have to use them proportionately from those allocations. But the total amount available or required has to be calculated based on the sum. So I just thought I'd add that nuance.
Yeah, good clarification. Yeah, because we get those questions a lot. Yep. You can use it from anywhere. All right, any questions in the chats? Yeah, I saw a comment from Elizabeth say they may set this up to 15%. Yeah, that's correct. All right, now that we've talked about CEIS and CEIS calculation, then we move on to the more complicated stuff, more complicated concepts under CEIS. The relationship that exists between CEIS and your LEA maintenance of effort reduction. And before I get to the details, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what is the MOE adjustment or reduction. Basically, as an LEA, when you receive an allocation increase between 2 fiscal years, let's say last year you had a certain amount for your allocation, and this year you have an increase. 50% of that increase in your allocation could determine the amount by which your LEA may be allowed to reduce its MOE, its maintenance of effort. So you have more money in your IDEA, you take half of that increase, 50%, you could choose to reduce your MOE by that amount. However, there are certain conditions. It doesn't just come that easily. If your LEA wants to reduce MOE because of the allocation increase, then the first condition is that the amount of expenditures that will be reduced under your special education maintenance of effort should be reallocated to activities that are approved under ESA. That means you don't reduce the funds so that you could spend it on something that is not related to an ESA program. It has to be specific, a specific reallocation. When you do that, then you could reduce your maintenance of effort. In addition to that, if you receive a determination of meet requirements, you will be eligible to reduce your MOE. Let's say if you have a needs assistance or you don't meet the requirement or you need assistance, then you will not be eligible to reduce your maintenance of effort. Or if you had any issue related to your program monitoring, if the responsibility to provide FIP was taken by the USBE, or if you had significant disproportionality, like we talked earlier. So if you have significant disproportionality and you have to set aside 15% of your IDA allocations for CCEIS, then you will not be eligible to reduce your MOE in the event you have an increase of your allocation. So this is a pretty quick summary and overview of the regulation, but I wanted to go over that before we get to the interaction. So if your LEA wants to set aside CEIS, voluntary CEIS, you have to do that with caution if you also want to reduce your MOE as a result of an allocation increase. And here's the reason why, is because the two provisions under IDEA interact. And let's get into the details. And that's
Anthony, will you back up for just a minute? We got one note in the chat that someone was really lost. And so if you'll just go back a slide again. Okay. And I think it's important to understand this is an exception or a reduction to MOE that isn't available very often because generally your IDEA allocations don't change. But we felt, and Neil felt, it was important to talk about this today because we know there's going to be an increase in IDEA allocations from the American Recovery Plan, the latest recovery package, stimulus package. So it's confusing, but if you are under a determination of meets requirements, you haven't had any actions taken against you, you don't have significant disproportionality, then when you have an increase in your LEA allocation, there's this allowance, it's called the MOE adjustment, that allows you to decrease your contribution under MOE from state or state and local funds by half of the amount of what the increase is. And Claire, I don't know if that helps, we'll send this out, but I just wanted to back up Anthony and repeat that one more time because I don't think most LEAs have probably ever used that adjustment. And I know USBE calculates MOE on your behalf. And so, but it's just important to understand that there will be an opportunity, especially due to this increase of funds coming, to reduce your MOE slightly. So I hope that helps, but yeah, maybe you can keep going, Anthony, but I just wanted to make sure we repeat it again because we had at least one person lost.
Yeah, so Claire said that she got lost. Claire, was that helpful? Maybe you can just mention that in the chats before we move on. We don't want to lose anybody in the process. Okay, so she said yes, we're good. Okay, so now that you have an allocation increase and if you are interested in reducing your maintenance of effort because of your allocation increase, and at the same time, you want to set aside funds for CEIS purposes, then you have to do it with caution because if you do the two together, then there are some sort of consequences. And I'll get to that in the next slide here. This is pretty much the language from IDEA regulation. The amount of funds expended by an LEA for early intervening services under 326 shall count toward the maximum amount of expenditure that the LEA may reduce under MOE adjustment. That's the citation. And maybe this example will help you better understand the interaction, because numbers sometimes makes more sense than lengthy sentences. So let's say your LEA received an allocation of 1 million last year. So that was your allocation of 611 last year. And then in the current year, you have an allocation increase. So you went from 1 million to 1.4 million. So your total increase is 400,000 for 611. And then you also have a current allocation of your IDEA 619 funds of 100,000. So if your LEA wants to set aside voluntary CEIS funds, then you have to take your current allocation of 611 funds plus your current allocation of 619, just like we saw in the previous slide, and you multiply that by 15%, and that will give you the amounts your LEA is allowed to set aside for CEIS. And with this number, that amount is 225,000. So that's CEIS. Now we get to the LEA maintenance of effort reduction. Like I said in my previous slide, and Sarah also explained it further, if you have an allocation increase, so you take your current allocation minus your previous allocation, and you multiply that by 50%, and with the numbers we have in this example, the amount of MOE reduction available is 200,000. So these are the amounts you could set aside for CEIS or reduce your LEA MOE by if you do these two independently. But if you now choose to combine the two, then the combination of the amounts you set aside for CEIS and the amounts that you choose to reduce your LEA MOE cannot exceed 200,000. That means if you're hoping to set aside 225,000, as soon as you touch MOE reduction, that 225,000 is capped at 200,000. And this is really complicated. I hope it's making sense. And if that doesn't help, let me know.
Hey, Anthony, I just also dropped a link to Cypher's quick reference guide on CEIS where this came from in chat, so that if they want to go back and look at it later, they'll have access to it.
Okay, and we have a question from Jen Martin. If a school voluntarily sets aside CEIS funds, does the school have to do it every year going forward? The answer is no. Because like the word said, it's voluntary, it's optional. You can choose to do it one year and not do it the next year. And also, even in the same year, you could choose to do it, and maybe if your plans have changed, you could always come back to the USDE and let them know that we changed our mind and we want to reallocate our CEIS funds. So it's totally optional. Great question, Jen. Any questions about this interaction between the two provisions? Because I felt like this was really important for you to know in case you want to do CEIS when you also want to use LEA MOE reduction flexibility under IDEA. Okay, we don't have any more questions in the chat, then we can move on to the next section. Now let's talk about allowable use of funds for CEIS. Period of availability. When are the funds available for CEIS? The period of availability is pretty much the same as your IDEA total allocation. So the funds are available for you to use for 27 months. And if an LEA voluntarily reserved CEIS funds, it may request the funds be made available for other allowable IDEA project purposes at any time during the period of availability. And that's what I just said earlier. You could say, oh, we want to set aside voluntary CEIS, and mid-year you change your mind, contact Neil, and then they can make an adjustment to your budget if you change your mind. For LEA who are required to set aside CEIS, this is mandatory CEIS, however, you cannot use those funds for other purposes. So the funds must be reserved for CEIS activity. And if you don't use those funds at the end, then the funds will go back to the state and to the feds. So under mandatory, it's not optional. The funds are earmarked for CEIS and must be spent for that purpose. Okay. And then another thing, like any other federal funds, a cost to be allowable must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Same thing with CEIS expenditures. So in addition to everything that we just mentioned, like the allowable activities, you also have to make sure that the costs that you choose are reasonable and also necessary. And this is just a refresh. This slide was covered earlier. I'm not going to spend more time on it, but these are just the activities that CEIS funds could be used for. Professional development for your teacher or other school staff, and also educational, behavioral evaluation, services, support, including scientifically based literacy instructions. For mandatory CEIS, same thing, professional development are allowable activities, educational and behavioral evaluation, services, and support. In addition, in your mandatory CEIS plan, you have to address factors that are contributing to significant disproportionality. So if your LEA has significant disproportionality, you have to be able to identify why. What are the reasons why we have significant disproportionality? And then when you identify the reason, in your plan, you must address the policies, the practices, the procedures that are pretty much making the situation worse for you. So your plan must be addressing those so that you could avoid falling in a situation where you have significant disproportionality. So these are just the allowable use of fund and under CEIS. From here, I will let Sarah take over because she is going to share with us a scenario that would be helpful. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks. And I know we have a good mix of special ed program people on the call today and business officers and people from accounting office as well. So I want to talk through a little bit, walk through what this looks like if I, as an LEA, whether a charter or a school district, am sitting down to make this decision and thinking about who are the students that will receive CEIS and how are we going to track those students. So Anthony, if you go to the next slide, and this example is from a practice guide that we wrote together with some colleagues. I wrote together with some colleagues from the IDEA Data Center and the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting. And it's a few years old, but the concept still applies even though the years are older. So the background here is that during our planning for the school year, in this case, the 17-18 school year, we have reviewed data on math performance for our kindergarten through third grade children. This is part of maybe our early grades PLC we're planning, and we have identified 3 groups of students who didn't meet at least one of the 4 formative math assessment benchmarks that we monitored through progress monitoring throughout the last school year, 16-17. And so we found these 3 groups of students. And we have a group of children who didn't meet 1 or 2 benchmarks. They don't qualify for any additional math interventions right now. They are not needing to be referred for special education and related services. They're not identified for that. So they're not kids with disabilities. They're not qualifying for other math interventions. Then we have this other group of students. We're going to assume we have an RTI or MTSS model in our LEA that we're implementing. And we have the children who didn't meet 3 or 4 benchmarks, but also were not identified for special education and related services. These are children who do not have disabilities, but have not met those benchmarks. And this qualifies them in my LEA for math intervention through our tier 2 of our MTSS or RTI system. We have trained aides during math group time. They come in and provide that. Those kids get an intervention. And then there are children who didn't meet 1 to 4 benchmarks, but they received special education and related services. There are kids with disabilities who are getting help for that, maybe through pull-out or the push-in of the special ed teacher during that math group time. So in thinking through that planning, a district could say, gosh, how are we going to get to those kids in group 1? And one way to get to them is through CEIS. And so thinking about how are we getting to those kids, again, this target group is these children on the bottom of this slide here who didn't meet 1 or 2 formative math assessment benchmarks. So we have some way to separate out a group of kids. And this is important for CEIS because the professional development can be really broad. So in this case, our intervention to get to those kids who aren't getting specific interventions through special education or through tier 2 of our multi-tiered system, we're going to get to them through CEIS. But our CEIS we're going to use to provide professional development on scientifically based math interventions to all K through 3 teachers at the beginning of the school year. And this is so those general education teachers, our teachers in the classroom, those K through 3 teachers, they are going to then be providing what we would call coordinated early intervening services to those students who don't qualify for tier 2, don't qualify for special ed, but could use some extra accommodation or intervention during class. So we've got our group of students, and this is really important when we think about voluntary CEIS. And I will say one of the things I tend to advise districts and LEAs is to think about the program first and then think about the funds to pay for it in this way, because when you just start thinking about how the funds can be used, they can be used so broadly that you may end up not getting narrow enough with what your intervention is for CEIS and what your targeted student group is. And so in this case, our target group is that group of kids. They didn't meet those benchmarks last year, but they don't qualify for extra math interventions. So in this case, there could be 60 teachers who all attended training who are going to end up teaching this group of children. So when we track students, so if you go to the next slide, Anthony, we have to think about tracking a group of students. And theoretically, you could say every kid in our school who isn't a kid with a disability needs extra support and track every student. That probably isn't very reasonable, but in this case, we're tracking kids in this target group. We know who they are, and they're children who didn't meet those benchmarks, and then they were taught by these teachers who received the CEIS funded professional development. So those teachers provided them some sort of extra intervention or accommodation, somehow accommodated them during their math lessons based on the professional development they received. So we will track all of those students, again, narrowed by those 2 criteria, and follow them for the year that we provided that professional development, so that 17-18 year, and then the next 2 years as well, to see if they are eventually identified for special education. And we don't have to count when the state comes back and sends us the survey and says report on how many students received CEIS and how many of those students became students with disabilities. If you've used funds for CEIS, you'll recognize that. We don't have to report the students who were special education students or the students who received other math interventions, just this targeted group of students. Even though we did provide professional development to all of the teachers, we've really narrowed that. And lastly, on the budget, just thinking through what planning looks like, and we will share these slides so you have them, that based on the planning, this LEA in this example did budget and use 15% of its funds, and they could pay for the professional development, and the allowable cost would be the cost of the training, the supplies and the materials, funds that LEAs use to pay teachers or to pay for substitutes during the training, and meeting space fees. All of those pieces would be appropriate. Again, this is for all teachers, but the important piece here is that we have identified a target group of students, and those students exist in every class. It may only be 1 or 2 students, and this training is going to benefit many more students than that. But for CEIS, when you're planning this, you want to get as specific as you can about that group you're trying to get to with the funds, because then when you have to track kids for the next 2 years to see if they end up receiving special education and related services, it's much easier to follow them. So hopefully that's helpful. I know I think we're learning on these trainings, Anthony, we have a lot of information prepared and we will share it with you, but yeah, if you have any questions about that, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll respond to them. I know we're moving quickly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I think this was really important to give them an example of a real life situation.
All right, so I mentioned earlier we were going to talk about some more nuanced examples of how districts might think about using funds for CEIS or CCEIS. So we're going to go through some questions and answers. We'll pose a question and then we'll pop the poll up so you can tell us what you think. You're going to tell us if you think it's allowable, not allowable, or if you're not sure. For the purposes of the examples that we have here today, let's go ahead and assume when you see CCEIS that the district has exercised its due diligence and that it has already determined that the factors that are underlying that have led to the determination of significant disproportionality.
Alison, before we move on, we had a question in the chat.
Oh.
What is the program code for IDA 619 and 611? Neil, could you help us?
Yeah, I shared the information in the chat already. So for like fiscal 21 will be 21 FTFL is the 611 or the school age program. And for preschool, or it would be 21 PRE or 619. And that's the code that appears on the allotment memo as far as when you receive your funds or the budget's have been activated, what you'll see on the allotment memo.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have another question. When you say share the slide, how will this information be shared?
So we'll post this information to our website under fiscal resources. And I will share, when it's posted and active on our website, I will share a link with everybody in the group.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Any more questions for Neil before we move on? All right, Alison, I think we can go forward.
All right, so the first question for you to consider: may CEIS or CCEIS funds be used to purchase supplemental interventions for a student who's been determined to need this additional support to succeed in the general education program? And I am going to post the poll. And tell us, do you think this is an allowable cost under CEIS? Yes, no, or it depends.
And again, please drop in the chat the logic of your reasoning. Why do you think it's a yes? Why do you think it's a no? Why do you think it depends? I think it's more important than just your answer.
All right, about 32% of people have weighed in so far.
Yeah.
Give it a few more seconds.
They are being a little shy on this question. Okay, we're getting more votes. %. I think we're.
All right, are we ready to end the poll?
I guess so. All right, and then the chat was pretty quiet, so I can understand that some are hesitant to give an answer. But if you are part of last presentation, it's always, it depends. If you say it depends, that means, I mean, you could be half, 50% wrong, 50% right, so it's always a safe choice. So now let's go over, like we have 44% of people saying yes, 25% say no, 32% say it depends. Okay. And then the answer is generally it would be allowable. So CEIS and CEIS fund may be used to fund supplemental academic and behavioral intervention for students determined to need additional academic and behavioral support to succeed in general education program. Just like we shared in the previous slide, I mean, this is an example that is pretty much addressing the intent and the purpose of early intervening services. Sarah, did you want to add something?
I would just say the only reason I would say it depends is that for mandatory CEIS, when you have significant disproportionality, we would have to have that extra piece that it was focused particularly, but not exclusively on students in that over-identified category, right? So there may be allowable costs like supplemental interventions that would not be approved because they weren't for students, they weren't connected, right? So you could have it, it doesn't have to be exclusive for that category, but if you are addressing significant disproportionality, it should address those contributing factors. So it's a little bit of an add-on, but yeah, in general, allowed is great.
Yep, like I said, you're always creative. All right, and we have something in the chats. Marianne, on this.
I think Mandy was sharing the program codes from the COA.
Oh, gotcha. Side conversation.
Thank you, Mandy, for sharing.
All right, are we ready for the next poll?
All right, core curriculum. May CEIS or CCEIS funds be used for the purchase of core curriculum? Let me relaunch the poll and just tell us yes or no, or it depends.
And please, again, if you can, drop in the chats, why do you think it's a yes or a no? %, 43%. I think we are stuck there. Okay. And then 4% think it's a yes, 52% think it's a no, and then 43% it depends. And I'll go ahead and go over the answer. Generally, the reason why I say generally is because Sarah will always come back with something. But I say generally, it is not allowable because in no way core curriculum is addressing those specific behavioral and intervention that are the intent of early intervening services provision. But Sarah, do you have anything to say?
I think that that's the important piece. It's probably not what the curriculum is, but how it's used, right? And so if you're paying for it for the intention of providing that basic education to everyone, then no, it wouldn't be allowed. I think Elizabeth's point in the chat, she said, what if it comes with intervention pieces as an addendum to the core? I think that's a perfect example that you could split the cost, right? So if you wanted to purchase like, again, math training, And that math training, I apologize, if that math training included 2 days on the core and then an additional day on how to provide interventions or how to supplement the core for students who need extra help, then that third day of training could be paid for with CEIS. The same thing if you're buying a curriculum that includes both the core and then extras, you'd want to split that cost. And often that's the best thing to do with CEIS funds. I will say rarely are they enough to pay for something that is really going to like pay for a huge program or a huge curriculum for the school. But if you can figure out how to do that, we would call that braiding funds. If you can figure out how to braid those CEIS funds with some other funds from title or from state funds, or right now ESSER funds, right? If you can figure out how to braid that and use CEIS to pay for part of it, that's where you're usually going to get the most benefit from your CEIS, is if you put that together. So Elizabeth, you're right that it depends if that has that extra, and then you would just want to make sure that you put some other funding in for the pieces that aren't supplemental.
Yeah, good point, Elizabeth. Yeah, like adding that intervention piece changes the conversation. And that's the reason why I say generally at the beginning. Okay, I think we are 5 minutes away. We are going to end here. But the remaining of the PowerPoint content will be made available to you, like Neil mentioned. But at this point, I think we'll move to the last slide. We won't have time to cover all these questions, but these are great for activity if you want to practice your level of understanding. And then we did mention that for LEA that will need to set aside a CEIS fund, or if you are required to set aside a CEIS fund, you will need to track your information for students and expenditures, and the USBE will adopt a CEIS tracker. And then Alison, I don't know if you can share the link through the chat box. And I think this will also be made available to LEAs through USB resources. So this will be the tool that you'll use to start tracking your activities, like for students, and also the expenditures as it relates to the planned activity under CEIS. And then we also have additional links for resources. If you want to study more about CEIS, you're more than welcome to. And Alison, if you can share the links in the chats. And the links will also be available in the digital version of the PowerPoints, I think. And like Sarah mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we offer opportunity for individualized support. So WestEd, in partnership with USB, is offering one-on-one coaching. If, for example, you want to explore option of setting aside CEIS fund because you feel like there is a need for your LEA, we are available for one-on-one coaching, and also the coaching goes beyond just CEIS. It could be related to anything like allowable use of fund in general, time and effort. And we could also review your policies and procedures and then provide some technical assistance and guidance. So we encourage you to get in touch with us. We'll share our contact information there if you want to set up a time for a coaching session with WestEd's team. And we have a last polling question before we end. Alison?
All right, so we asked you this at the beginning, and we want to know how you're feeling now. How would you rate your knowledge of coordinated early intervening services and comprehensive coordinated early intervening services fiscal requirements under IDEA now that we've gone through some of this information in the training? Very strong, strong, fair, or weak? And let me share the poll.
Okay. How do you feel after today's presentation? Still getting more votes. I think we're stuck at 41%, Allison. You can end the poll and share the results. Okay, so I do see that we have more strong, 38% strong. I think we started at lower than that, if I recall.
If we had 47% fair and 47% weak, so 94% in the bottom two at the beginning.
Okay, so we have 10% weak, and you know, be patient with yourself. These concepts are really complicated. It takes time to get used to it, but this was just like a broad overview. And like we said, our Wested team is available for coaching session, and these are our contact information if you want to set up a time to get more individualized coaching session around these topics. But at least we have fewer weeks. That is encouraging. I was hoping to see more in the very strong category. So Sarah, Neil, do you want to say something to close out?
I'd like to thank Sarah, Anthony, and Allison for their time they spent preparing this presentation for us and helping us in Utah better understand CEIS services, both voluntary and mandatory. I would highly encourage taking advantage of the coaching sessions that we have provided funding for LEAs to have some one-on-one coaching in any area of IDA fiscal, not specifically CEIS, and to reach out to them. If you have any questions, concerns, or need additional assistance, also feel contact me, and we can do the best we can to help everybody else out.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for having us. And yes, please be in touch if there's anything we can help you with. We're happy to.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.